The mountain lion was less than 15 feet away when Maya Chen realized she was going to die. The massive cat crouched low on the rock outcropping above the trail, muscles coiled beneath tawny fur, amber eyes locked on her with the focused intensity of a predator that had already committed to the kill. Maya stood frozen on the narrow hiking path, her water bottle slipping from nerveless fingers to clatter on the stones, every survival instinct she possessed screaming contradictory instructions. Run, don't run, make yourself big, back away slowly, fight back, play dead. None of it mattered. At 20 years old, alone on a remote Colorado trail 3 miles from the nearest road, Maya was about to become a statistic in the rare but devastating category of mountain lion attacks on humans. The cougar's haunches tensed for the spring that would close the distance in a single explosive leap. Maya opened her mouth to scream, though she knew no one would hear, and then the sky exploded with black wings and harsh, rattling calls that shattered the tense silence of the forest. Ravens, not just a few but dozens of them, diving from the pine trees in a coordinated assault that seemed to materialize from nowhere. They came in waves, massive corvids with wingspans approaching 4 feet, swooping at the mountain lion's head, striking with talons and beaks, filling the air with such chaos and noise that the predator recoiled in confusion and growing alarm. The cougar swiped at the attacking birds, managing to knock one from the air, but three more immediately took its place, diving at its eyes, its ears, its sensitive nose. The birds fought with precision and coordination that went beyond simple mobbing behavior, the defensive strategy ravens sometimes use against hawks or eagles. This was different. This was deliberate, sustained, fearless combat between birds that weighed barely 3 pounds each and a predator that outweighed them by 40 times, and somehow, impossibly, the ravens were winning. Within 90 seconds, the mountain lion had abandoned its intended prey and retreated up the rocky slope, harassed every step of the way by the relentless aerial attack. The birds pursued it for another 100 yards before breaking off their assault and returning to the trail where Maya had collapsed to her knees, trembling with adrenaline and shock and disbelief at what had just happened. As she looked up through tears she had not realized were falling, one particularly large raven landed on a boulder directly in front of her. The bird tilted its head, fixing her with one obsidian eye, and made a sound that was not the harsh call of the attack, but the softer, almost questioning vocalization that Maya had heard thousands of times over the past 8 years. It was obsidian, the raven she had saved when she was 12 years old. The bird who had started everything, who had brought the first gift, who had somehow communicated to an entire clan of ravens that this particular human was worth protecting, worth bringing treasures to, worth remembering across years and teaching the next generation to remember. And in that moment, as Maya stared at the bird who had just orchestrated her rescue from certain death, she understood that the relationship she had built with these ravens over 8 years had never been the charming curiosities she had documented in journals and videos. It had been a genuine bond, recognized and honored by creatures whose intelligence and emotional capacity humans were only beginning to understand. To comprehend the magnitude of what happened on that Colorado trail, you need to understand how it all began with a 12-year-old girl and an injured juvenile raven on a spring afternoon that changed both their lives in ways that would eventually challenge scientific assumptions about corvid, cognition, memory, and the very definition of friendship across species. Maya Chen was an unusual child, which was something her parents, David and Lynn Chen, had recognized from the time she was old enough to walk. While other toddlers played with toys, Maya watched birds. While other children begged for trips to playgrounds, Maya wanted to hike in the foothills around their home on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, binoculars around her neck and a field guide to Rocky Mountain birds clutched in her small hands. By age 10, she could identify over 100 species by sight and sound. By 11, she was keeping detailed observation journals that documented nesting behaviors, feeding patterns, and seasonal movements with precision that would have impressed professional ornithologists. Her particular fascination was with corvids, the family of intelligent birds that includes crows, ravens, jays, and magpies. Maya was captivated by their complex social behaviors, their problem-solving abilities, and the stories she had read about crows recognizing individual human faces and even holding grudges against people who had wronged them. She spent hours watching the ravens that lived in the ponderosa pine forest near her home, noting their interactions, their vocalizations, their apparent play behaviors that seemed to serve no purpose except enjoyment. On a Saturday afternoon in April 2016, Maya was hiking alone on a familiar trail when she found him. The juvenile raven was grounded beneath a tall pine, one wing extended at an unnatural angle, surrounded by a scatter of black feathers that told the story of a violent fall or collision. The bird was conscious but clearly in pain, making distressed calls that stopped when Maya approached. Instead of fleeing or showing the fear that wild birds typically display toward humans, the raven simply watched her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess whether she represented threat or help. Maya knew the conventional wisdom about wild animals. Don't touch them. Don't interfere. Call wildlife rehabilitation services and let professionals handle the situation. But she was 12 years old, the nearest wildlife rehab was 40 miles away, and the injured raven was looking at her with such focused attention that she felt compelled to act. She pulled off her sweatshirt, approached slowly while talking in soft, reassuring tones, and carefully wrapped the bird in the fabric. The raven did not struggle. He simply allowed himself to be picked up, as if understanding that this human's intentions were benign. The hike back to her family's house took 20 minutes, during which Maya held the injured bird against her chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her hands, talking constantly about what she was going to do to help him. Knowing he could not understand her words, but believing that tone and intention might communicate safety. Her parents were less than thrilled when their 12-year-old daughter walked through the door carrying a wild raven, but they also recognized the determination in Maya's expression and knew that arguing would be futile. David Chen, a software engineer with a practical approach to problems, made calls to wildlife rehabilitation centers, while Lin Chen, a pediatric nurse with medical training that translated reasonably well to avian anatomy, helped Maya create a temporary enclosure in their garage using a large dog crate, soft towels, and a heating pad set on low. They offered the raven water in a shallow dish, which he drank from immediately, in small pieces of raw chicken, which he accepted with less enthusiasm, but eventually consumed. The next day, a wildlife rehabilitation specialist named Jennifer Marks arrived to assess the bird. She examined the injured wing carefully, determining that it was severely bruised but not broken, and taught Maya how to create a figure-8 wrap that would immobilize the wing and allow it to heal properly. She also provided crucial information about raven diet, behavior, and the warning signs that would indicate if the bird was in distress beyond what home care could address. Most importantly, she looked at Maya with complete seriousness and said something that would prove prophetic. Ravens remember, if you help this bird, if you treat him with kindness and respect during his recovery, he will remember you, not just for a few weeks or months, for years, maybe for his entire life. And he might share that information with other ravens. We do not fully understand how, but corvids seem to communicate about individual humans, spreading information about which people are safe and which are threats. Maya named the raven Obsidian for his glossy black plumage that caught light with hints of blue and purple iridescence. She spent 2 weeks caring for him, changing the wing wrap daily as Jennifer had taught her, providing food and water, and spending hours simply sitting near his crate, talking to him, reading aloud from her ornithology books, establishing the kind of calm, consistent presence that would help a wild animal feel secure rather than trapped. Obsidian watched everything she did with intense focus, learning to recognize her footsteps, vocalizing greeting calls when she entered the garage, showing none of the fear and stress that Jennifer had warned were common in ravens held in captivity. The day came when the wing wrap was removed and Obsidian needed to test whether he could fly again. Maya opened the crate in the backyard, stepped back, and watched as the young raven hopped to the opening, paused as if considering his options, and then launched himself into the air. His flight was initially awkward, but strengthened with each wing beat until he was moving with the powerful direct flight pattern characteristic of ravens. He circled the yard 3 times, gaining altitude, and Maya felt a mixture of joy and loss, knowing she had done the right thing but mourning the end of their brief time together. Obsidian landed on the roof of the Chen family's garage. He looked down at Maya and made sounds that resembled conversation. Then he flew off toward the pine forest behind the neighborhood. Maya watched him until he disappeared. She returned to the garage to take apart the crate that had been his recovery space. She tried to convince herself that this was the end of the story. She had saved a wild bird's life. He had returned to freedom. It seemed like a complete and satisfying narrative with no loose ends. 3 days later, when Maya went to her backyard to fill the bird feeder for the chickadees and finches, she spotted something on the wooden fence post that hadn't been there before. A smooth, perfectly round pebble of translucent quartz caught the morning sunlight. It looked less like a random stone and more like something placed intentionally for her to find. Perched on the garage roof and watching her discover his gift was obsidian. Maya stood still, staring at the stone. Her mind raced through possibilities. She knew that some bird species, especially corvids, sometimes brought objects to humans, but the behavior was rare and not well understood. Was this truly a gift? Or was she assigning human ideas of gratitude to a bird that had merely dropped a stone while eating or playing? The placement seemed too perfect, too deliberate. The pebble sat centered on the flat post, positioned exactly where Maya would notice it while approaching the feeder. She picked up the stone, feeling its smooth weight in her palm. Looking up at Obsidian, the raven made a soft, almost questioning sound, tilted his head, and flew off into the pines. Maya carried the quartz pebble inside and set it carefully on her desk. She shared her encounter with her parents, feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Her father was skeptical and thought it might be coincidence. Her mother, more attuned to patterns and connections in her nursing work, considered the possibility of it being genuine, but warned Maya not to expect it to keep happening. But it did continue. The following week, a blue glass bead, worn smooth by water or time, appeared on the same fence post. A week later, a brass button showed up. Then there was a small twist of copper wire, a broken piece of mirror, and a silver twist tie from a bread bag. Each item was placed in the same spot. Each time Maya found a gift, Obsidian was close by, watching her response. Maya began documenting everything in a journal she called the Raven Project. She noted the date, time, location, description of each gift, weather conditions, and observations about Obsidian's behavior. She took photos of every object, creating a catalog that would eventually serve as important evidence in the scientific discussion about corvids giving gifts. She researched everything she could find about similar behaviors, discovering that while stories existed of crows bringing gifts to humans who fed them, the behavior was considered anecdotal and not scientifically proven. By summer, the gift-giving had established a pattern. Maya would visit the backyard 2 or 3 times per week, and more often than not, a new object would be waiting on the fence post. Obsidian's visits became regular as well, though he never allowed Maya to approach closely. He would perch on the garage or in the nearby pine trees, vocalize occasionally, and observe her with that penetrating corvid stare that made it feel like he was actively thinking about her, rather than simply viewing her as a feature of the landscape. Something else happened that summer that would prove significant. Other ravens began appearing in the yard. First one, then two, then eventually a small group that would arrive with Obsidian and perch nearby while Maya discovered the latest gift. These ravens were not as comfortable with Maya's presence, maintaining greater distance and showing wariness that Obsidian did not display. But they watched everything, paying particular attention to how Maya interacted with their companion, how she carefully collected each gift and examined it with obvious pleasure and gratitude. Maya researched raven's social structure and learned that these intelligent birds form complex family groups in multi-year pair bonds. Young ravens often remain with their parents for extended periods, learning survival skills and local knowledge that goes beyond instinct. The ravens accompanying Obsidian might be his siblings, his parents, or simply other juveniles from the local population. What was clear was that they were observing the gift-giving behavior and Maya's response to it, learning that this particular human was safe, friendly, and worthy of engagement. The gifts became more varied and sometimes more valuable. A small silver earring, a polished agate, a child's plastic ring with a fake gemstone, a commemorative coin, several shiny bottle caps. Once, a real $20 bill, folded into a neat square. Maya's parents insisted she turn the money into the police in case someone had reported it lost, but no claim was ever filed. She suspected the ravens had found it in a parking lot or near a trash can, drawn to its metallic shimmer in the sunlight. When school started in September, Maya was entering 7th grade with a secret that set her apart from her classmates. While other students talked about summer camps and family vacations, Maya had spent her summer establishing a relationship with wild ravens who brought her gifts. She wanted to share the experience but feared ridicule or disbelief. Ravens bringing presents to a 12-year-old girl sounded like a fairy tale, not like something that happened in suburban Colorado in the 21st century. She confided in her science teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, who had recognized Maya's unusual interest in ornithology and had lent her advanced field guides that went beyond the basic texts. When she showed him her documentation, his eyes widened with genuine excitement. He contacted a colleague at the University of Colorado Boulder who studied animal behavior, and within 2 weeks, Maya found herself presenting her journal and photograph collection to Dr. Patricia Emery, a researcher whose work focused on corvid cognition and social learning. Dr. Emery examined Maya's documentation with the careful attention of a scientist evaluating potential data. She asked detailed questions about timing, frequency, Maya's interactions with the ravens, and whether Maya ever fed the birds or provided any material reward that might explain the gift giving as simple operant conditioning. Maya explained that she had never fed the ravens, had never offered them anything, and had only provided medical care to Obsidian during his recovery from injury months before the gift giving began. Dr. Emery was cautiously intrigued but skeptical about drawing conclusions. Gift-giving behavior in corvids was one of those frustrating phenomena that seemed to occur just often enough to be real, but not frequently enough to be studied systematically under controlled conditions. Most reports were anecdotal, from people who claimed crows or ravens left objects for them, but could not provide systematic documentation. Maya's careful record-keeping was unusual, but 4 months of observations was hardly sufficient to establish scientific validity. However, Dr. Emery proposed something that made Maya's heart race with excitement. She wanted to set up a long-term observational study with Maya as the primary data collector, documenting the gift-giving behavior and any other interactions with the ravens. She would provide Maya with better photography equipment, teach her systematic observation protocols, and check in regularly to review the data. If the behavior continued and could be documented with sufficient rigor, it might contribute to the scientific understanding of corvid's social behavior and cognition. This decision launched what would become an 8-year collaboration between Maya Chen and Dr. Patricia Emery, producing one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies of human-corvid interaction ever conducted. Maya became not just a subject or an anecdotal source, but a genuine research partner, learning methodology and statistical analysis while documenting phenomena that challenged existing scientific frameworks about animal cognition and interspecies relationships. The gift-giving continued throughout Maya's middle school and high school years, evolving in ways that suggested increasing sophistication and possibly even communication between the ravens. By the end of the first year, Maya had documented over 200 distinct objects, each cataloged and photographed. The ravens, who now numbered between 5 and 8 individuals that visited regularly, had learned to associate Maya's backyard with safety and positive interactions. More significantly, the ravens began demonstrating behaviors that suggested they were teaching younger generations about Maya. In the spring of her 8th grade year, Maya noticed juvenile ravens accompanying the adults to her yard. These younger birds showed typical corvid curiosity, but also clear instruction from the adults about how to interact with the human who lived here. Maya observed adult ravens demonstrating the gift-leaving behavior, while juveniles watched, then saw the juveniles attempt their own deliveries, sometimes dropping objects clumsily or placing them in slightly wrong locations until corrected by adult supervision. This multi-generational teaching was exactly the kind of behavior that separated simple instinct or conditioning from genuine cultural transmission. The adult ravens were passing knowledge about a specific human to their offspring, creating a tradition that transcended individual experience. Maya was no longer just interacting with Obsidian and his immediate associates. She was being integrated into the social knowledge base of an entire raven clan, becoming a feature of their cultural landscape that would be remembered and acted upon by birds who had never directly experienced her care or kindness. Dr. Emery was astounded when Maya's documentation revealed this teaching behavior. Cultural transmission in animals was well established in certain species, like orcas and chimpanzees, but documenting it in wild corvids in real time was extraordinarily rare. The implications were significant. If ravens could learn and teach information about specific individual humans across generations, their cognitive and social capacities were far more sophisticated than most research had acknowledged. The types of gifts also evolved in ways that suggested possible understanding of human preferences or values. Early gifts had been random shiny objects, the kind of things corvids are naturally attracted to because of their visual properties. But over time, the objects became more specific and sometimes more personal. On Maya's 14th birthday, a small silver heart-shaped locket appeared on the fence posts, the kind of inexpensive jewelry that might have been lost at a park or swimming pool. The timing was certainly coincidental, but Maya kept the locket anyway, touched by the randomness that felt like intention. During a difficult period in her sophomore year when Maya was struggling with academic pressure and social anxiety, the Ravens brought a series of particularly beautiful objects: a perfectly intact blue jay feather, a piece of sea glass worn smooth and frosted, a tiny ceramic bird that had probably broken off a decorative plate. Maya could not help but feel that these objects carried a message of support, though she knew attributing such emotional sophistication to birds was exactly the kind of anthropomorphism scientists cautioned against. But Dr. Emery was becoming less skeptical about emotional capacity in corvids. Her broader research was revealing that ravens and crows demonstrated behaviors that met reasonable definitions of empathy, cooperation, and even consolation of distressed group members. A study from the University of Vienna had demonstrated that ravens could take the perspective of other ravens, anticipating their actions and needs. Research from the University of Washington showed that crows recognized individual human faces and could hold grudges for years against people who had captured or threatened them, while showing preference for people who had treated them kindly. In this context, Maya's relationship with the Raven clan was not an isolated anomaly, but part of an emerging scientific picture of corvids as creatures with complex social intelligence, long-term memory, and capacity for relationship formation that had been wildly underestimated. The gift-giving was not simple conditioning or instinctive behavior. It was social interaction, maintained and taught across years and generations, demonstrating that these birds valued the relationship enough to invest time and energy in sustaining it. By the time Maya started college at University of Colorado Boulder in 2020, the gift collection numbered over 1,500 objects. She had dedicated an entire wall of her childhood bedroom to displaying them, creating an installation that looked like an art piece, but was actually a scientific record of an 8-year relationship between human and ravens. She documented each new addition in the research database she shared with Dr. Emery, noting patterns, unusual items, and behavioral observations that accompanied the gifts. The ravens continued visiting even after Maya moved into campus housing, though she returned home most weekends specifically to check the fence post and maintain her connection with the clan. The birds adapted to her less frequent presence, timing their visits to weekends when Maya was likely to be home. This suggested they were tracking her patterns somehow, perhaps by observing her vehicle's presence, or simply by monitoring the house for signs of her activity. Obsidian remained the primary gift giver and the bird most comfortable with Maya's presence. But he was aging now, showing the slightly dulled plumage and more cautious movements of a raven in his 7th or 8th year. Ravens in the wild can live 15 to 20 years, so Obsidian was entering middle age, and Maya had started to think about what would happen to their relationship when he eventually died. Would the younger ravens continue the tradition? Or had the gift-giving been primarily Obsidian's behavior, maintained by his companions, but not deeply internalized by the next generation? The answer came during Maya's sophomore year of college. She was home for winter break, checking the fence post on a snowy December morning, when she found something that made her breath catch. Resting on the post was a silver locket, tarnished with age, engraved with initials she did not recognize. But tucked inside the locket, visible through its crystal face, was a tiny photograph, faded and water-damaged, but still recognizable as a portrait of a young woman from perhaps the 1950s or 1960s. This was not a random shiny object. This was a piece of someone's history, a treasured keepsake that had been lost and found by ravens who somehow understood it was significant. Maya felt a profound responsibility to find the locket's owner or their family, to return something that clearly carried emotional weight beyond its material value. She posted about the locket on local community forums and social media, describing where it was found and asking if anyone recognized it. Within days, she received a message from an elderly woman named Dorothy Morrison, whose mother had lost a silver locket while hiking in the Boulder foothills in 1962. Dorothy had been a child when it happened and still remembered her mother's distress at losing the heirloom that contained a photograph of Dorothy's grandmother. The reunion of Dorothy with her mother's locket, after 58 years, became a local news story. Reporters were fascinated by the tale of ravens bringing gifts to a young woman over 8 years, and particularly by the recovery of this specific piece of jewelry that carried such historical and emotional significance. The story spread beyond local media, picked up by regional outlets, and eventually by national news organizations looking for uplifting content during a difficult period of pandemic and social unrest. Maya found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight, conducting interviews where she tried to explain the complexity of corvid cognition and the scientific significance of her documentation, while also acknowledging the emotional dimension of her relationship with the ravens. She emphasized Dr. Emery's research, the systematic observation protocols they had followed, and the broader implications for understanding animal intelligence. But she also talked honestly about how the ravens had become part of her life in ways that transcended scientific study, how their faithful presence and mysterious gifts had provided companionship and wonder during the challenging years of adolescence and early adulthood. The publicity generated both positive and negative responses. Some people were moved by the story, sharing their own experiences of unexpected connections with wildlife. Others were skeptical, suggesting Maya had fabricated or exaggerated the relationship, that the gifts were random coincidences she had strung together into a narrative. A few wildlife officials expressed concern that publicizing such interactions might encourage people to interfere with wild animals inappropriately, creating dependencies or habituating animals to human presence in ways that could ultimately harm them. Dr. Emery defended the research and Maya's role in it, pointing out that Maya had never fed the ravens, never attempted to tame or domesticate them, and had maintained appropriate boundaries while documenting naturally occurring behavior. The ravens initiated and maintained the relationship on their own terms, visiting when they chose and keeping their natural wariness of most humans. This was not habituation or dependency, but genuine interspecies relationship formation, the kind that occurred occasionally throughout nature when individuals from different species found mutual benefit or simply compatibility in shared space. The debate highlighted fundamental tensions in how humans approach wildlife. The traditional conservation model emphasized strict separation, treating any interaction between wild animals and humans as potentially corrupting or dangerous. But newer frameworks in conservation biology and animal behavior science were beginning to acknowledge that such rigid boundaries might be neither possible nor desirable in an increasingly human-dominated world. Perhaps the goal should not be total separation, but thoughtful coexistence, learning to share space with wild animals in ways that respected their autonomy while acknowledging that relationships could form across species lines. Maya returned to relative obscurity after a few weeks of media attention, grateful to resume her normal life and her studies in ecology and evolutionary biology. But the experience had crystallized something for her. She wanted to pursue research on corvid cognition and human-wildlife coexistence, building on her unique personal experience to contribute to scientific understanding of these remarkable birds. Dr. Emery became her official undergraduate research mentor, and Maya designed a senior thesis project that would systematically analyze 8 years of gift-giving data, looking for patterns and correlations that might reveal information about corvid cognition, memory, and social behavior. The analysis revealed fascinating patterns. The frequency of gifts increased during periods when Maya was home more often, suggesting the ravens tracked her presence and responded to it. The types of objects showed clear preference for shiny, colorful, or unusual items, consistent with known corvid attraction to novel stimuli. But there were also statistical anomalies that were harder to explain through simple behavioral models. Certain objects appeared during emotionally significant times in Maya's life, clusters of particularly beautiful or valuable gifts that corresponded with periods of stress or difficulty she had documented in her journal. Was this evidence that the ravens could somehow sense or respond to Maya's emotional state? Or was it coincidence, amplified by human pattern seeking and confirmation bias? The data could not definitively answer the question, but it raised possibilities that demanded further investigation. Maya's thesis earned high honors and was nominated for a prestigious undergraduate research award. More importantly, it established her as a serious emerging researcher in the field of corvid cognition, someone who combined rigorous methodology with unique longitudinal data. She completed her degree in May 2024 and intended to pursue graduate studies in animal behavior at the University of Washington, which hosts one of the foremost corvid research programs globally. Prior to the start of her graduate studies in the fall, she opted to spend her summer at home, appreciating the Colorado mountains she adored and reconnecting with the raven family that had played such a crucial role in her life for the past 8 years. Little did she know that this choice would lead to an encounter that would confirm all she had observed and recorded, providing striking real-world proof that her connection with the ravens was more than mere scientific interest, but a true relationship with significant life-and-death consequences. The morning of the mountain lion encounter started unremarkably. Maya set out early on a familiar trail in the Roosevelt National Forest, a moderate 6-mile loop that wound through ponderosa pine forests and offered spectacular views of the Continental Divide. She had hiked this trail dozens of times and knew it well enough that she felt comfortable going alone, though she carried a whistle, bear spray, and her cell phone for emergencies. The early summer morning was perfect for hiking, cool and clear, with wildflowers blooming in alpine meadows and birds active in the canopy overhead. She was approximately 3 miles in, at a section where the trail narrowed along a rocky ridge, when she became aware of being watched. It was nothing she could identify specifically, just a feeling of presence, the kind of instinctive awareness that had kept human ancestors alive on savannas full of predators. Maya slowed her pace and scanned the terrain around her, looking for whatever had triggered her unease. That was when she saw the mountain lion. The cougar was positioned above the trail on a rock outcropping, perfectly positioned for an ambush. Mountain lions are ambush predators that rely on surprise and short, explosive chases to catch prey. This one had clearly been stalking Maya for some distance, waiting for the ideal moment to attack. The fact that Maya had spotted it before the final rush probably saved her life, but only by seconds. The cat's body language indicated it had already committed to the attack. Its ears were flattened, its eyes were locked on her, and its hindquarters were tensed for the killing leap. Maya's mind went blank with terror, then flooded with fragmented survival information. Mountain lion attacks on humans were rare but occasionally fatal. Fighting back was recommended, unlike with bears, where playing dead might be effective. But how did you fight a 140-pound predator armed with claws and fangs, designed to kill prey much larger than humans? Her bear spray was clipped to her pack, but there was no time to reach it before the cat would be on her. The mountain lion began its leap, covering the distance between outcropping and trail in a powerful spring that would bring it down on Maya with enough force to knock her to the ground where the cat's superior strength would be overwhelming. Maya raised her arms in a futile defensive gesture, preparing for impact when the first raven struck. The bird came out of nowhere, a black projectile moving with incredible speed, hitting the mountain lion's face with talons extended and wings beating furiously. The cougar's leap faltered, its trajectory thrown off by the unexpected assault. It landed on the trail but not on Maya, stumbling slightly and swiping at the bird that had struck it. Before it could recover and attack again, 5 more ravens were diving from the trees, each one targeting the cat's head and eyes, striking and retreating and striking again in waves that never gave the predator a moment to orient itself. Maya stumbled backward, nearly falling on the steep trail, watching in disbelief as the scene unfolded. The ravens were fighting as a coordinated unit, timing their attacks so that as one bird retreated, another was already incoming. They focused on the cougar's most vulnerable points, its eyes and nose and ears, causing pain and confusion while staying mobile enough that the cat's retaliatory swipes rarely connected. When one raven was knocked down by a lucky swipe of the cougar's paw, two others immediately increased their attack intensity, drawing the predator's attention away from the injured bird, who quickly recovered and rejoined the fight. The mountain lion was clearly used to being the apex predator in these mountains. Nothing challenged it, nothing fought back with this kind of coordinated intelligence. The birds were not acting on simple defensive instinct. They were problem-solving in real time, adapting their tactics based on the cougar's responses, communicating through vocalizations that sounded like battle commands. After 90 seconds of sustained attack, the cat's nerve broke. It turned and fled up the rocky slope, pursued by the ravens who continued their assault until the cougar had put significant distance between itself and the trail. Only then did the birds return, settling in trees around the trail where Maya had collapsed, still trying to process what had just happened. Her mind struggled to reconcile what she knew about animal behavior with what she had witnessed. Ravens occasionally mob predators that threaten their nests or young, but this was different. These birds had collectively risked their lives to save a human, driving off a predator that could have killed any one of them with a single bite or swipe. As Maya's breathing gradually steadied and the adrenaline began to recede, she looked up at the ravens perched in the pines above her. Most maintained a respectful distance, but one large bird landed on a boulder directly in front of her, tilting its head and fixing her with an obsidian eye that she knew as well as she knew her own face in the mirror. It was Obsidian, now in his 9th year, his plumage showing the slight fading of age, but his intelligence and focus undiminished. Maya had no words adequate to what she felt. Gratitude seemed too small for what had just occurred. These birds had saved her life, deliberately and at significant risk to themselves. The relationship that had started 8 years ago with an injured juvenile raven had evolved into something that transcended the boundaries scientists drew between human and animal consciousness. Obsidian had remembered her. He had valued their relationship enough to bring his entire clan to her rescue, and they had fought with coordination and courage that demonstrated cognitive abilities and emotional depth that most people still did not believe birds possessed. She spoke his name, her voice breaking with emotion, and Obsidian responded with that soft, almost conversational vocalization that had become their private language over 8 years. He hopped closer, not quite within touching distance, but nearer than he had been since his release all those years ago, and they regarded each other across the small space that separated human from bird. Two beings from radically different evolutionary lineages who had nevertheless found common ground. The other ravens began to depart, flying off in pairs or small groups. Their emergency response concluded now that the danger had passed and their human was safe. But Obsidian remained, keeping watch as Maya slowly recovered her composure and began the long hike back to the trailhead. He flew ahead, landing periodically to wait for her to catch up, clearly escorting her to safety the same way a wolf pack might guard an injured member until they reached secure territory. When Maya finally reached her car and Obsidian flew off toward the pines without looking back, she sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to understand the implications of what had occurred. This was not anecdotal coincidence or anthropomorphic projection. 8 years of relationship building, of gift-giving and observation and mutual recognition had culminated in an act that could only be interpreted as deliberate rescue. The ravens had saved her life because they valued her life, because she mattered to them individually and collectively. Dr. Emery's response when Maya called her from the trailhead parking lot was a mixture of scientific excitement and genuine concern for Maya's well-being. She insisted Maya go to the emergency room to be checked for injuries or shock, then met her there to hear the full account of what happened. Maya recorded every detail while it was fresh, describing the mountain lion's behavior, the raven's coordinated attack, Obsidian's presence, the escort back to the trailhead. Dr. Emery recorded the account and took careful notes, recognizing that they were documenting something extraordinary that would have significant implications for how scientists understood corvid cognition and interspecies relationships. In the days that followed, Maya's experience became the subject of intense scientific and public interest. The incident challenged fundamental assumptions about what corvids were capable of cognitively and emotionally. Defensive mobbing was well-documented bird behavior, but this was not mobbing in any conventional sense. The ravens had not been defending nests or territory. They had deliberately intervened to protect a human with whom they had an established relationship, demonstrating planning, coordination, courage, and what looked unmistakably like altruism. Dr. John Marsloff, perhaps the world's leading expert on corvid cognition and the researcher Maya would be working with in graduate school, reached out personally to discuss the incident. Marsloff had spent decades studying how crows and ravens recognize individual human faces, remember positive and negative interactions, and even appear to hold grudges or show preference based on past experiences. But this went beyond recognition and preference. This was active intervention on behalf of a human at significant risk to the birds themselves. Marsloff proposed that the incident represented several important phenomena converging. First, the multi-year relationship between Maya and the ravens had established her as a valued member of their social landscape, someone worthy of protection. Second, the gift-giving behavior over 8 years had been genuine social interaction, maintaining and reinforcing the bond between human and ravens across time. Third, the teaching of younger ravens about Maya meant that multiple generations recognized her significance, allowing for collective action when she was threatened. And fourth, the coordinated attack on the mountain lion demonstrated sophisticated cognition, including risk assessment, tactical adaptation, and communication under high-stress conditions. The implications extended far beyond this single incident. If ravens could form such relationships with individual humans, remember and honor them across years, teach information about specific humans to subsequent generations, and ultimately risk their lives to protect those humans, then the cognitive and emotional capacities of these birds demanded fundamental reevaluation. They were not simple stimulus response organisms or even just clever tool users. They were beings with complex social intelligence, long-term memory, capacity for relationship formation that crossed species boundaries, and something that looked very much like loyalty or love. Maya's documentation of the 8-year relationship, combined with the dramatic rescue, became the foundation for several scientific papers co-authored with Dr. Emery and Dr. Marsloff. The research challenged existing frameworks for understanding corvid cognition and contributed to a growing body of evidence that intelligence, consciousness, and emotional capacity were far more widely distributed across the animal kingdom than traditional science had acknowledged. Ravens joined the ranks of elephants, dolphins, great apes, and other species recognized as possessing sophisticated cognitive abilities that demanded ethical consideration beyond simple animal welfare standards. But for Maya, the significance was more personal. The ravens had given her a gift far greater than all the shiny objects and trinkets she had collected over 8 years. They had given her their trust, their protection, and ultimately their willingness to risk themselves on her behalf. It was a gift that could not be quantified or cataloged, that existed in the realm of relationship and emotion that science was only beginning to take seriously in non-human animals. She continued visiting the fence post in her parents' backyard throughout that summer, and the gifts continued appearing, though perhaps with slightly less frequency as the Raven clan returned to normal behaviors after the dramatic rescue. Each object was received with gratitude that now carried deeper meaning, understanding that these tokens represented 8 years of relationship building, of mutual recognition and respect between species that evolved along entirely different paths, but somehow found common ground. When fall arrived and Maya departed for graduate school at University of Washington, she left behind the fence post in the backyard that had been the site of so many gifts. But she carried with her something more valuable, the knowledge that consciousness and connection were not unique to humans, that relationship could transcend the boundaries of species and language, and that sometimes the most profound bonds formed in the most unexpected ways. Obsidian was aging, and Maya knew that his time was limited. Ravens in the wild rarely live beyond 15 years, and he was already 9. But the younger ravens who had learned from him about the human who mattered would carry that knowledge forward, teaching their own offspring about Maya Chen, creating a tradition that might persist long after both Obsidian and Maya were gone. The relationship had become bigger than the individual bird and human who started it. It had become culture, passed down through generations of ravens, a story about how different beings could recognize each other as significant, could build trust across the chasm of biological difference, and could ultimately honor that trust with action that defied purely mechanistic explanations of animal behavior. Maya's research at Washington would focus on corvid cognition, gift-giving behavior, and the mechanisms by which these birds form and maintain relationships with humans. She would approach the questions with scientific rigor, using controlled experiments and systematic analysis to understand the cognitive processes underlying behaviors she had observed firsthand. But she would never forget that behind the data and the analysis were individual birds with individual personalities, capable of decisions that looked remarkably like friendship, loyalty, and love. The fence post remains in the Chen family's backyard in Colorado, and gifts still appear there occasionally, though Maya is now hundreds of miles away pursuing her graduate studies. Her parents check the post regularly, photograph new items, and send the images to Maya, maintaining documentation of a relationship that began 8 years ago and shows no signs of ending. The younger ravens continue the tradition their elders taught them, bringing trinkets to the place where the human lives, honoring a bond that transcends any simple behavioral explanation. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about animal intelligence and emotion, if it reminded you that consciousness and relationship exist in forms we are only beginning to understand, then share it with others who need to question the boundaries we draw between human and animal minds. Subscribe to Wildlife Tales for more stories about the extraordinary cognitive and emotional lives of creatures we share this planet with. Turn on notifications so you never miss documentation of the connections that prove intelligence and love are not uniquely human, but part of the broader mystery of consciousness that expresses itself throughout the living world. And if you ever see a raven watching you with those intelligent, dark eyes, consider that you might be in the presence of a being capable of recognition, memory, judgment, and relationship. Consider that the bird might be assessing you, deciding whether you are worth remembering, worth bringing gifts to, worth protecting if the need arises. Consider that the boundaries between their world and ours are far more permeable than we have believed, and that sometimes when we extend kindness to another being, that kindness returns in ways we could never predict, but should always honor. Maya Chen learned this truth through 8 years of patient observation, systematic documentation, and genuine relationship building with ravens who taught her that consciousness comes in many forms, that intelligence wears many faces, and that love and loyalty know no boundaries of species or language. She learned it most dramatically on a mountain trail when birds she had known for years risked everything to save her from a predator, proving that the relationship was real, mutual, and worth defending. And Obsidian, the injured juvenile raven who started it all, taught Maya perhaps the most important lesson of all, that every living being we encounter is an individual, capable of memory and emotion and connection in ways we may not fully understand, but should always respect. That kindness given freely, without expectation of return, sometimes comes back in forms more precious than we could imagine, and that the greatest gift we can receive from another being, human or otherwise, is the trust to be ourselves in their presence, knowing we are seen, recognized, and valued for who we are.